The title of the talk today, The Meaning Beyond Words, is essentially a snapshot of the book that I wrote recently, How Language, Race, and Culture Impact Science, Teaching, and Learning. So I wrote a book and we released it in a pandemic. So the book came out in January and I've been in the house ever since. So this is my best attempt to give you kind of an idea of what's going on. But I want to start with the big issue. And for me, we're experiencing a revolution in education. Let me say it is cognitive and social. So for example, we used to have these things, right? And these things, we call them the same thing. They're both called cell phones, but these two things should not be compared. In fact, the younger people that I deal with tell me, don't call me, text me. It's more efficient. Like they don't even want you to call anymore. This device is better than my college computer. It is gives me. It is the GPS. I used to have a GPS, TomTom GPS machine that I would put in my car if I was going places. It contains that. It is so much more dynamic than we really consider. It is a revolution that happened quiet. We used to take taxis, right? And now people are, will jump in a car of a stranger as long as the stranger has that same app, right? It sounds peculiar if you think about it that way, but Uber and Lyft have changed the way that we move around the country. I would argue classrooms have experienced a less subtle revolution, meaning this. These classrooms, take one from 1800, one from the 2000s, look nearly identical. Students in rows sitting as the sage on the stage communicates, right? It is about the teacher. We had to revolutionize this the minute the pandemic took place, right? We could not do what we've done before, and teachers did incredible work. So here's the message. Have we really engaged in the revolution that's necessary for improving teaching and learning, right? And that requires us to really ask ourselves, well, how does learning work? And so we're gonna use the chat because this is important. There was a time, just stay with me here, that if I asked you, hey Jennifer, I need to get to James Elementary School, how do I get there? There was a time when you would tell me, okay, you're going to take exit 451, take a right on Jones, take a left on Adams, and then two rights on your right-hand side is right there, right? I don't know everybody here, but I can almost guarantee you cannot do that anymore, right? And I want to argue that essentially what has happened is you've deleted those directions, that turn-by-turn GPS system in your brain. You deleted it the moment you had a smartphone. Additionally, right? This is on the left. Some people don't even know what this is. This is what many of us used to use. These are actual phones. You spin the numbers. If you call the wrong number, you get this sound, doo, doo, doo. And then someone would say, hey, you called the wrong number. But there was something really powerful that happened when you called the wrong number. Is getting the number wrong made you ask, hey, what's that number again? And you remembered it. And some of you are not going to know this, but there was a time I would meet people and say, hey, what's your number? They would give me their number without pen or paper, just put it to memory, and I would call them at a later date and time, right? I only know my mother's phone number, right? I'm gonna redirect that. Let me say it differently. I know my mother's phone number. I know my wife's phone number. I have two children. I could not tell you their cell phone numbers right now. In the chat, tell me why. It's an important next step. Why is it that we deleted turn-by-turn directions? Why is it that we no longer remember cell phone numbers? I need that information. Really quick, put it in the chat. All right, we don't use it. Our technology does it for us. We can look it up because a lot of brilliance here, right? The phone does it for us. We don't need it. It's handy. It's stored in the phone. We don't use it. So much agreement from people in so many different places. Well, here's the deal. Stay with me now. We don't need it. We don't use it is the fundamental context. So do we need science information? I can Google it. How does protein synthesis work? I can Google it. Right? How does it? What is the outer layer of an electron called? I can Google it. Right? So if we can't remember phone numbers and we need to learn them, right? Then how is it that we're supposed to teach science content? And the argument for me is that learning is learning is learning. So let me go back to this point. There was a subtle revolution that happened. We have more information in the palm of our hand than we've ever had before. Therefore, unless it's important, unless I use it, I will automatically delete it. So here's the question, right? How are we teaching? Are we teaching in a way that forces our students to use the information so that it can become pertinent, meaningful? We'll get to that in a second. This revolution is so powerful. I'm asking the teachers that I train, let's explain these science ideas. And so we're going to explain with some practice videos, just really short videos that we call 20-second stories. And what I found is, here's one about water structure and hydrogen bonding, that if you look at the bottom, there's over 140,000 views. So here's what this means. When I wanted to get information, I would go do this incredible thing called reading. I would read the book, read the chapter, go to an encyclopedia, go to a library. I would go read about it, right? The students that I get a chance to work with, they read second. First thing they do is they're looking for YouTube videos. The second thing they're doing in their assessment of the YouTube videos, they're looking for the most efficient way to get it. So don't show me a 17-minute YouTube video. Give me the 2-minute YouTube video to explain a concept. So here's my point. The way that we're getting information, the accessibility of information has changed, right? I believe you told me that we'll delete it unless we use it, unless it's meaningful. So the question is, right, how are we teaching students so they're really getting the value of their science information? Because we know that they've already shifted paradigmatic, right? They're living a digital lifestyle. For most of them, this is the only world they know. I tease my kids all the time. Can you tell me how to get home? Right? If from here, do you know how to do it? They don't even think in terms of turn-by-turn direction. Their first response is, well, let me just put it in the GPS to figure out how to get home, right? So here, my message is this, is they live in a world. I'm sorry, I got muted there. So they live in a world where computers are a part of their extension. It is the tool that works with them to derive information. All right. So this is kind of stage one of the big idea. Here's the question. Are we teaching how learning works? Are we teaching how learning works? We'll come back to that. So here's something that's a burning issue, right? Where I live, I'm in Northern California. It says, COVID is devastating. It has this devastating impact. But did you know that it's having a differential impact on African American, Latinos, particularly of lower SDS? So here's a feature and factor saying in Louisiana, 70% of the cases were people are of African descent. In Illinois, 42% of the cases. And so I'm going somewhere. So here's where I'm going. If pertinent information is the information that we retain, if the use of information is the information that we retain, then how are we teaching science concepts in the context of this world that we're living in, right?
Excuse me, Dr. Brown. Excuse me. There are two big black boxes on my screen. Are they supposed to be there? Maybe it's something with my, I don't know. I'll cut out.
Tell me what you see. Tell me what you see. I need a verbal comment because I don't see the chat anymore. You all see the slides?
Perfect. That's perfect. Perfect.
All right.
That was perfect. The blocks are gone.
No, thank you for that. Hold on 1 second.
Share your screen instead of your slides out.
Right. There we go. All right. So I want to get to this so we have time to talk. But here's the issue. Science is serving a vital role in our making sense of the world. I don't think you have to sell a kid anymore in your classroom how important science is right now. Our discussions of vaccines, our discussions of antibodies, of immunity, it is absolutely vital. Bioengineering has never been so central to our collective understanding, right? Who feels like they have access to science, right? And I want to get to that issue. So I'm trying to make the point that we're in a current state where science is of a value to us. We cannot remember the things that we don't talk about every day. You cannot turn on the news without being able to think about bioengineering, biology. I'm arguing, let's teach the things that make the young people experts, but let's not forget who has access. So here's the subtext. I started, when I wrote a book, I started writing a book because I saw this image. For those of you who don't know, this is James Meredith. This is 1965, I believe. He's headed to register to class for the University of Mississippi. So at Ole Miss. And so what's striking to me is the people to his left and people to his right are there to help him. These are National Guardsmen there to assist. If you take a look behind him, you see people there to help him as well. I just want you to take a look at the faces. So I saw this image. What was most striking to me is that here's a young person headed to college. It's still college, civil rights movement or not. He's going to college under the duress of an expectation that he's now representing everybody in his community. And look at the support system. They look angry. Look at the opposition. They look angry. And so the picture was fascinating to me because I started to imagine, well, what was it like in day 2? No one's there. It's just James Meredith in class. He's answering a question. He's writing a paper. When he wrote a paper, did people assess his work equitably? Right? Was he able to raise his hand and answer a question and be comfortable and receive equitably? And I'm going to argue that whatever it was more difficult than it should have been. And there's a phrase in the African-American community that talks about this, and it's called the black tax. And it's the idea that's an additional cost to dealing with racial inequity that's part of your education. And so therefore, you got to work harder to know that even though this thing exists, we expect you to work through it with this additional burden. This is the notion of the black tax. And so I started to think, well, is there a modern version of that? So fortunately, we've progressed a great deal, and we don't have to bear the same burden that James Meredith bore. Now, interesting enough, he graduated. He got a PhD from that institution. He opened the doors for admission to people. So he did an incredible work, which he should be lauded for. But the question is, do those things still exist? And if so, in what form? And so I'm going to argue today that one form of the modern black tax is linguistic racism. There's a general bias that continues to exist in U.S. school systems around language. So let me say, John Ball talked about language register and language choice, the power to choose. So, for example, there's no reason anyone should have a Boston accent anymore. You know why? Because people move all across the country. So why have a Boston accent? Why have a New York accent? Why have a California accent? There's no reason for accents. And here's the reason why you have an accent, because I want to sound like grandma. I want to communicate in the same way that my culture and community communicate. But here's the question. Which communicative forms do we value? Right? Think about it. Close your eyes for a second. An intelligent person's accent, what does it sound like? Is it a thick Boston accent? Is it a thick Southern accent? Is it a thick California accent? So how we associate the way a person sounds with perceptions of intelligence, right, is associated with how linguistic racism works, right? We want intelligence to sound a particular way. But I'm going to argue that it's a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to take you to the national championship game. This is Florida State University, 2014. This is Jameis Winston. He throws a touchdown pass. They win the national championship. The reporter sticks a microphone in his face and says, Jameis, how do you feel? And here's what he says.
15 to go in this game. Final drive. What did you tell your teammates around you?
I said, guys, we didn't come here for no reason. I said, guys, this is ours, man. This is all the adversity we went through. The first few quarters, it was ours to take. And like I just said, we control our own destiny. And those men looked me in my eye and they said, we got this, Jameis. And I said, are you strong? They said, I'm strong if you strong. And I said, we strong, man.
After struggling through the first half, what was the biggest adjustment you guys made at halftime?
We had to go back to playing Florida State football. We came out here, we were letting us be bigger than the game. We were bigger than the game. Then we had to say, hey, let's play Florida State football because can't nobody be bigger than this game. And we did that, and we came out victorious.
Right, so here's what happened, right? So this is a way for me to use Twitter for research purposes. And so at January 7th, 2014, 12:09 a.m., Didi McCarron says, am I listening to English? So Didi McCarron, by the way, is the mother of A.J. McCarron, who is the quarterback at the University of Alabama, who won the championship the previous year. Am I listening to English, right? So apparently she received some negative feedback. She says, anyone that knows our family knows we're far from racist. My tweet was not meant in any way, was not meant that way. I sincerely apologize if I offended anyone, right? So this is at 1:39, just about an hour later. Reggie Bush says this. He says, love listening to this dude, Jameis Winston, talk after games. Walks and talks like a true champion. A great role model for kids to look up to. I'm going to leave that alone. But again, 12:10 a.m., January 7th, he's watching the same thing. And then here again, someone named LeBron James says, unfreaking believable interview by Jameis. You just watched that interview. Just shows part of the reason why he's so special. So here's the question. How could three people see the exact same thing and interpret it differently? And I'm going to argue this is huge for us. because it's about expectation. What do you expect him to sound like? What are the rules for language communication? I'm going to argue today that there's a problem, and it deals with this word organic language. We use the word organic as a word that I don't like at all. In chemistry, it means you're made from a carbon-based structure, so almost everything is organic, right? But we use organic in popular culture to mean left alone. No norms, no explicit definition. We're just going to leave it, right? It's organics, left alone. So here's the deal. Who decided how you're supposed to speak in an interview? Imagine if that question was, hey, James, how do you feel? And he said, well, it was a fascinating competition. We lost our focus. And unfortunately, we were struggling because we seemed to lose our focus at a particular time. Our coach helped us stay the course. It would not have sounded authentic to who he was. And that is the key. So who is he? He was a 19-year-old African-American male from Mobile, Alabama. He was the leader of a team that was predominantly African-American, full of African-American males from the southeastern United States. And so speaking in the way that he spoke is purely reflective of the culture that he lives in. It fits, right? But the expectation, right? He's being measured by an expectation that has never been communicated to him. So we allow the norms of language to be undefined. So when you walk into a classroom, how do we talk? So for example, we play this terrible game of guess what's inside my head. You know all the information because they hired you to teach it. You allow your students to come into the room and then you ask them questions. And then only the person with the right answer is allowed to speak. So then no one wants to speak because unless I have the right answer, right, why am I sharing my idea? Because the teacher is looking for right ideas. And so you've been in lots of professional development that says we're not going to do that, this IRE instruction. But the idea is that the norms of language are not communicated. How we told our kids, I need you to tell me what you think. Wrong ideas are awesome. They are gifts to me because I can now know where you are and we can make sure we work together to master the content. And then here's the other part. We default to the culture of power. So in this particular case, it was not okay for him to sound like an African-American male from Mobile, Alabama. And my question for you is, how do your young people communicate the science that they know? And can you hear it when it is communicated in so-called non-standard English, right? So essentially, that's what the initial chapters of my book are about, is that smart people are not smart because they use big words, right? Big words are tools to represent ideas. And more importantly, the idea came first, and then we label the idea second. So why would we teach with no affordance, with no bridge for the complex language tool that we learn? And here's what happens, right? Science involves both new ideas and new words simultaneously. And if we're not careful, we'll often communicate in gibberish and students won't understand the ideas and feel completely uncomfortable. So this can present what we call the language identity dilemma. I'm going to get through it quickly because we want to talk about practice. And so here's the language identity dilemma. On one end, there's a cognitive challenge. I don't understand what's being explained. You've been in chemistry class in the university or physics or biology, and the professor is standing in front of you. I don't understand what's going on. Too many symbols, not enough clarity, and there's a cognitive problem. The other is that what if the students have the right answer, but explain it in a language that the teacher is not recognizing because the teacher is listening for science ideas communicated in science language, which is almost irrational because if I learned about the science outside of the context of my science classroom, I might have other words to explain that idea. So there's a cognitive challenge. On the other side, there's this emotive response, the frustration with jargon. If someone is communicating with you in a language that you don't understand, it causes you to get frustrated. More importantly, it says, I don't speak like this, I shouldn't be here. When I say speak, I'm talking about the textbook too, right? So when you're reading the text and it doesn't make sense, we cannot pretend that this part of the science learning is not a vital hurdle, right? And so we call it the language identity dilemma. So I've been studying this, by the way, for about 10 years. So what happens when we delve into what students actually know? So I'm gonna show you a quick excerpt, and then I'm gonna take you into some actual research studies. And so I studied years ago, you could have a mastery of science ideas beyond the context of science language. And so this is a picture of how a curveball curves. And so if you take a look, the ball is traveling following that red arrow, but it's also spinning that same direction. But on the top of the ball, the spin of the ball is in the same direction as the airflow. I messed that up. The spin of the ball is in the opposite direction of the airflow. At the top of the ball, the spin of the ball and the air pressure, opposite direction. On the bottom, the spin and the airflow are the same direction. So what that produces is what's called a Magnus effect or differential air pressure, right? You have greater push on the top of the ball than on the bottom, so the ball will dive quickly. If you tilt it this way, it'll dive left and right. And here's why that's important. It's the same principle that we use for spoilers on the back of a car. You want to create your air pressure that keeps the car down, and why airplanes fly, right? It's how you create lift on airplanes. But here's the subtext. Do kids understand the science of curveballs, and in what language do they understand it? So I'm going to show you a quick excerpt. The transcript is on the left.
Well, when you flick the ball, it cuts through the air. It has different airs under it and over it, and starts pressing it down, so it drops, and the air on the bottom is more loose in the right way, and it just like the heavy pressure makes it drop.
All right, so here we go. I'm going to the chat now. Here's a simple question: is he right or is he wrong? I love it. Laura says loose equals low air pressure, right? Sounds right to me. We're all so loose air. Now, I don't want to make a judgment here because I don't know. What I know is there's multiple ways to respond to this, and so let me show you one way I'd like you to think about responding. Is if he says when it ball flicks the air, it has different airs under it and over it. If he's thinking the air is actually different, well, there's sulfur on the top and nitrogen on the bottom, then we got a problem, right? But what do you mean by different airs, right? I want you first to just celebrate the brilliance of this answer. To say, that's awesome. This is a beautiful answer. Next question. What do you mean when you say different airs under it and over? Explain that, right? And if the answer is, well, the air is pushing harder on top than on the bottom, also, because you know what? Scientists have a word for that, and that's differential air pressure. We also call it the Magnus effect. So now I'm giving him new label for an idea he understands, as opposed to what we do is we leave the idea and the language stuck together, right? So the brilliance of this young person, I'm arguing we just need to recognize it by recognizing that people learn in the context, in the language tools of their context. In this case, the language of baseball, right? So we did more. We wanted to study. I'm a researcher, by the way. So my job is to actually identify if this works or not. So we decided, well, what if we just taught and simplified the language? Let's just separate language instruction from teaching. Make sure the idea was as clear as possible. Once that idea was clear, then we said, here's the science language. Now let's practice using that science language and then see if they learn different. So we call this disaggregate instruction. And so let me give you a quick snapshot of what that looks like. I'm gonna skip this and go right to this. So here's what it looks like. So this aggregate instruction, we have one group here. They got science language and everyday language. And because here's the thing with science teaching, there's no control group. Every teacher does it differently. Because you can't say here's a standard way of doing it. I know a lot of teachers use word walls or sentence frames. So it's really difficult. So we made our control group. They taught science and everyday language at the same time. So they would teach the big idea and say, okay, here's the science word. The experimental group, no science words at all, just simple language. We gave both groups a pretest. We taught the lesson, and then we gave both groups the post-test. So here's an example. Because we are worried about teacher skill, everything was online. So every student got exactly the same image. The only difference was the word. So here's one condition. They got oxygen, carbon dioxide, photons, and water. And so this is a part of a lesson to teach photosynthesis. The other group, good air that things need to breathe, airs that human breathe out, and light and water. Now, you might ask, where did I get these words? We did a pre-assessment. We wanted to know, well, what words, how would you describe what plants do? How plants are getting energy, and these are the words that the students use, right? So same exact images, right? The only difference, one is labeled this way with the simpler term, one has the science term. So as you can see, treatment group, we asked 3 types of questions, multiple choice. Overall, our treatment group scored about 10% higher than the control group. We asked what's called a disaggregate question. And so this is when we ask with very simple language the question. Our treatment group around 73% versus about 58% for the control group. And then we asked with very dense science language, that's what we call aggregate questions. Again, our treatment group outperformed the control group, and these are all statistically significant. Then we asked open-ended questions, right? So just tell me what you think. And again, across all measures, those who are taught with simpler language master the content better, right? So I want to show you something else we did. We did another study, and this one was very similar. Two groups, simple language group versus a complex language group. So one group, just very simple words, the other complex, and then we gave them a stress test. And so for example, this group, the text is really small. I'm just reading the first line. It says evaporation happens when water changes its shape. So very simple. Here's a control group. When water evaporates, it expands its bond length and changes to gaseous form. Complex language versus simple language, right? So we gave them a stress test. So you may have seen these things. On the left is a Stroop test. So a Stroop test, you have to ignore the color of the word and recognize what the word says. I messed that up completely. Ignore what the word says, recognize the color. So if the word green is written in red, you push the R button. But if the word green is written in green, you push the G button. On the right, it's called a flanker test. You have to identify the centermost arrow. And if you can see here, the centermost arrow is facing the opposite direction of the others. And so you push that arrow. Whatever arrow direction that is, you push the arrow. So it's a simple measure. Now, here's what needs to happen. You need to focus long enough to ignore the distractor. So if yellow is written in yellow, that's easy. It's called congruent. Those two things match. But if yellow is written in red, you have to ignore what it says and then push the R button. So it takes a little bit more focus. Similarly, so those are called incongruent measures. For the flanker test, if the arrow is pointed the same direction, it's easier. But if it's facing the opposite, it takes a little more work. So for the sake of time, I want to get through this. We have plenty of time for questions. Is that across all measures, you take a look at that top category, Stroop test. So this is our color test. When the items were incongruent, that means they didn't match. Those in the treatment group, 1,300 milliseconds. Those in the control group, about 1,700 milliseconds. That means statistically significantly faster. They are faster in their capacity to recognize these colors. Flanker test, incongruent, 600 milliseconds versus 1,000 milliseconds. So here's what that means. They were able to identify the arrow quicker. So what does that mean? It's akin to parallel parking. If you've ever parallel parked your car and the music is on, you can parallel park with the music on, but sometimes you turn the music down to enable yourself to focus. And so for us, these are stress measures. And what it shows is that language is literally taking up the mental capacity of the young people, so much so that they have trouble recognizing patterns. So if they learn better by starting with simple language, if they're less stressed, by starting with simple language, we argue we got to make sure our science instruction essentializes simple language first, so students master the ideas and then give them an opportunity to practice the science language. I'm going to move here. So let me take you back. So going back to this, right? We're going to forget it. I can't imagine. I'm watching my kids struggle right now. School is not that important, but we lied to them. We go to English class and say, writing an argument in an essay is the most important thing. You got to learn to do it or your life will never be the same. You go to history, you got to learn to think like a historian or you'll be bamboozled every time. You go to social studies, and I think you get the point. So class after class after class after class, we're telling them this is important information, knowing full well, unless they use the information, right, they're going to delete it anyway. So the argument is, how are we teaching science to make sure we're sustaining young people? They're leaving us being prepared to tackle the world and explain what they're doing. So in our teacher ed program, we have a 4-step approach that plenty of people use called cognitive apprenticeship lesson planning, where we take a 4-step approach to lesson planning. So assuming the students can't remember, I'm going to establish a problem that will require them to know the content that we're learning. So if I'm teaching protein synthesis, I'm never going to walk in the room and say, today we're going to learn about protein synthesis. Today, you know what we're going to talk about? Lactose intolerance. Because I need, every time your cousin is in the room farting, I need you to be able to explain exactly what's going on, right? That is a problem that is useful. You understand it, you explain it.
Yeah.
Modeling. So we start with teacher-centered activities. Then we shift to coaching. But these are student-centered. Now, this is important. If I learn by explaining, getting things wrong, then students have to have lots of opportunities to build a model, to explain. This is where NGSS practices come into play, right? To make an argument from evidence, but I have to have space to get it wrong, right? So we start with a problem. We model where it's teacher-centered to start, it's student-centered, and then fading. Lots of opportunities to explain, because in the explaining is where we develop mastery. I'm going to argue that you didn't really master the science content the way that you really needed to until you started to teach it. And so in our assessment activities, our fading activities, that's where we have our students teach. Now, if I picked cultural phenomena, then maybe we're doing a PSA around lactose intolerance. right? We're going to get direct to the content. Is there a question? All right, I'm gonna give you an example. So we might teach a lesson on osmosis by starting with why would it be bad to put a freshwater fish in a saltwater tank, right? We then may have some modeling activities. This is the teacher-centered component, right? Let's make sure we get the ideas out, try to extract the science language so it's really simple. Maybe we watch a video, the teacher lecture, we do a short reading, we watch a video, but we start with getting some foundational understanding. Then coaching activities. The students are more active. We do inquiry, we present models, maybe we do a Powtoon animation, we get an opportunity to kind of mix into the phenomena, and then dating. Students write essays, or students prepare their own video presentations about why this might work. And so this is cognitive apprenticeship teaching. I'm gonna stop here and give you a quick excerpt of what that might look like. So when our teacher training program, we have our teachers practice this, and here's what a cognitive apprenticeship lesson plan might look like if I had to explain it. So here's a lesson on osmosis.
Now, we all know and love the story of Finding Nemo. Father and son get separated. Son makes new friends in a fish tank. Father goes on an epic journey to save his only child. And, following the Disney way of life, everyone ends up living happily ever after. But, what if there was some dark twist lurking in the shadow of the story? What if the dentist who found our tiny orange friend actually gave Nemo to his crazy niece Darla? She doesn't know about marine life, and instead of putting Nemo into a new and friendly saltwater fish tank, she put Nemo into a freshwater fish bowl. Would it really matter? Saltwater, freshwater, it's all water, right? Would everything end up happily ever after for our little lost clownfish Nemo? No, no way. So what gives? Why can't you put a saltwater fish into a freshwater tank? Well, fish that live in the ocean, like our little friend Nemo, are happy campers when they're surrounded by water. There's salt inside Nemo's body and outside Nemo's body. Nature likes everything to be balanced. And this is exactly what happens for saltwater fish when they're in a saltwater environment. Because again, there's salt on both sides of Nemo's skin. But when you put a fish like Nemo into freshwater, the conditions around him change. Now, unlike his happy home in the ocean, Nemo has more salt in his body than the freshwater around him. Nature hates that there's more salt on the inside than on the outside and wants to balance this out. Now, if we could look through a microscope at Nemo's body, we would see that there's tiny openings in his skin, kind of like doorways. Now, the salt molecules inside Nemo's body are way too big to fit through these tiny doorways. But water molecules are super small and fit perfectly through them. Only water can move easily in and out of a fish's body. Nature wants everything to even out, and the only way you can balance this is for water to start pouring into Nemo's body. Well, Nemo has so much salt compared to the fresh water surrounding him that the water just keeps coming in his body. With this effect, Nemo may as well have been a blowfish instead of a clownfish because he will swell up like a balloon. Eventually, he'll swell up so much that his cells will start to burst until finally he goes belly up. Poor Nemo. Doesn't really make for a very good Disney ending. This process of water flowing through these tiny doorways is called osmosis, and it's an amazing phenomenon. Don't put Nemo into a freshwater tank. He's a saltwater fish and needs to be surrounded by salt. The most important tip for our fishy friends out there, stay on osmosis's good side.
All right, so what you just saw is what the teachers in our Teacher Ed program do to prepare themselves. So we start by saying, all right, we need to rethink the content in a context that makes sense to the students that we're working with. And so in this particular case, this teacher chose Finding Nemo, and we found actually recently, kids don't watch Finding Nemo. That's an old people's movie. I was shocked to find out, right? You've got to find a context that really speaks to your kids, remembering unless they see it or talk about it, they can't remember it. They won't remember it. It's just not going to work. So let me give you another example before we come to a close here. So I'm going to offer the same lesson in a different context. So what if the lesson is about marinating meat, right? And so if we're thinking about, we're going to teach osmosis in the context of if marinades work, and there's actually seasoning and the seasoning gets into the meat, then there has to be some way for the seasoning and the liquids to exchange places, right? And so that story of osmosis and fusion has to be working there. Now, why is that important? Because you can't tell me a young person who learns the science of marinating can forget it now, because every time you see marinating, you're saying, okay, let's retrieve that information. You remember the lyrics to terrible songs that you don't remember because you hear them, right? And hearing generates that understanding. So we're arguing, when you pick your context, teaching in the context of students' lives is the way that they'll retain that information when they have information readily available. They have to talk about phenomena that they're seeing. Same lesson. So osmosis lesson might now be, why do we marinate carne asada, right? Why do we marinate chicken? Same modeling activities, the coaching activities, we're not going to change those necessarily. But when we fade, we may then have them do an experiment and give their family a marination guide, right? This is the best ratio of seasoning to liquid, because we want them to use that expertise in the explanation of phenomena. Now, the other thing that I want to really emphasize is the benefit of technology. So something that we've been coming across our new work, which I'm happy to share some other time, is that it is difficult to diversify our teaching force, meaning to find teachers of color to teach science and chemistry and biology. That's just difficult. We need to do some huge infrastructure stuff to make sure that we have teachers who can teach. But the technology we use for instruction can be extraordinarily diverse. And here's the good news. You can do it yourself. And the way that you do it is, if you're asking students to make assessments, you're asking them to explain phenomena, ask them to produce videos that you can use for instruction later on. I'm going to give you a quick excerpt. These are students who did a project on the digestive system, and this is about, well, you'll see.
I'm your Uranus. Your blood clean, and all that good blood, I put it back into you, cause that's still in your waist and your body is gonna do you wrong. And when the excess on the water is gone, your urine go find its way home. I'm number one. I'm your Uranus, similar to a water hose. Me plus your kidneys look something like headphones. Maybe an empty hall, or even 2 straws. But when I say straws, don't think of spitballs. Think of a water slide connected to a waterfall. But instead of the water, this is where the urine falls. Pause. Without me, nothing matter. Middleman to the kidney and bladder. What? I'm number one.
All right. You get the point that one of the benefits of technology is, when it's done well, it becomes a teaching tool. And so I really encourage you, is as we're making ways for students to explain phenomena, do yourself a favor and have your students build technological learning tools for you. And this was a music video to teach the urinary system. So I'm going to close with this. I want you to engage in social justice teaching by doing a few things. First, change your essential question. So when we come into the room, we're starting a lesson, instead of saying, how do the humans affect climate change? Let's talk about heat islands and how it impacts people from lower SES. There's an incredible study from Yale that talks about how the more dense the neighborhoods are, the greater the impact of climate change. Well, who determines the density of the neighborhoods, right? Redlining policies, things like that. Shift your questions. So why do my sister and I look alike? That's a great biology question. But let's shift to, is race biological? One of my former students, Brian Donovan, is doing incredible research about how the science of race is a byproduct of how we teach biology, right? If we just taught biology better, that people have less essentialist views, something to check out, right? So use social issues to create the need for learning, because I'm going to remind you, they can't remember it unless they're using it. So change your essential question. More importantly, change your formative assessment. So as your kids are explaining phenomena and discussing the phases of meiosis and crossing over, then talk to them about, well, how does this apply to issues like race, right? In discussing climate change and how it causes heat islands, have them explaining the big ideas of climate change by talking about how it impacts people from different socioeconomic status. Use the science content to explain larger issues, because their explaining produces their mastery, right? So give them practice explaining the concept in a social context. And lastly, let's get out of the classroom. Let's take on action-based summative assessment. You don't need any more multiple choice tests, long form essays. You can use them as formative assessments, but let's engage in summative assessments that get them out explaining what they know. Have students create video vlogs explaining biological basis of race using their new knowledge of meiosis, right? Have them write or create videos and send them to the city council about how we need to structure our homes to fight climate change, and how we need to specifically do that for people from lower SES, right? Give them an authentic task that requires them to use the science. Now, if they're practicing the science words in this aspect, then they'll master them. It's not complicated, right? We master the things that we talk about the most, but we need to make sure language is not a hurdle. And so our research team right now is working on using smartphones to enhance science teaching, how we can use technology as a cultural bridge. And we really want students to be producers of technology, right? And so I want to say, thank you for your time. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and answers, but here's the big idea. Well, I'm available on Twitter if you want to have a conversation later, but the idea is that we want to make sure we're engaging students in the science that explains how they're living and remove the language barrier, because it can be an easy way for students to feel like they're not a part of the science community. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
We're just going to ask people to write questions into the chat, and Brian will take them from there.
The name of the book is Science in the City, and it's you just read the book. And I literally just walked you through about 40% of it, but yeah, that's what it's called. Oh, Twitter. That is a good question. It's right there. Doc_B Brown. It's above my head. But do you have a website that you can share with? I do have a website, but I have to warn you, I'm going to share my screen. So what we're trying to do with our website is build a place where we can create and share social justice science lessons. So if you were to go to resources, this is a lesson, Making My Own Medicine, which is about protein synthesis. It is about antibodies and why certain people can make lactose, certain people can't. This is a lesson on the African approach to climate change in Tanzania. So there's VR videos exploring what's happening there. We have other lessons about plant. There's a COVID lesson. So we have some resources there you can take a look at. So, but it is, we just started. Here's a redlining urban heat island lesson. We're just starting this project, and so it's not even fully fleshed out. I don't have a full curriculum, but if you're interested, feel free to send us lessons, and we're open to working with anybody on really building out ways that we can teach science in an integrated way that teaches social justice. Dan Alder says, I often look for culturally relevant phenomena similar to the ones you share. You have a resource. Dan, I need you to be my resource. This is the issue, is that it's always changing, but there needs to be a team of us working together to go through NGSS standards and say, here's an issue that applies to each of these kind of content areas. So it just makes it easier for teachers, so teachers are not recreating. So the answer is no, I don't know a website where like NGSS or state standards are linked to culturally relevant or social justice ideas. That really puts the teacher in a position where they have to do that work. So great question. Question here from Heather. It says, what is your advice to those communities that lack in the types of diversity that you reference? What are the positive ways to build that bridge beyond more homogeneous communities? And so I happen to work in urban context, but I'm not arguing this only works in urban context. I'm arguing that the humanity of people is that they won't remember any information that doesn't give them explanatory power. And so let them tackle these issues. But I would start with the issues that are most local to them, the ones that they see. And then you can talk about other larger issues. And so you can't tell me your kids in a rural community can't get their heads around what's happening with issues of lead being found in local water systems and how that might be an issue. You can teach an ecosystem lesson. You can teach a lesson on osmosis and the water cycle through these things. And so I'm arguing, let's empower the kids to actually become active in explaining how phenomena matter into their community. So it is well beyond urban context. I just happen to focus in that area. There's another question about standardized testing. Yes, standardized testing. What are my thoughts about standardized testing? The standardized tests have not improved our teaching, and we refuse to give up on standardized testing. I will say that in 1994, the first year for our TIM study, the Third International Math Study, we discovered we were like 21st in the world, right? And we freaked out, and it gave us a reason to test more. What were we before that day, right? Were we great? We're hearkening back to the greater days of science when before we measured it. So the measurement, it is our GPS locator, right? So I'm not completely against it, but if we don't do anything, if we're just going to be punitive against the kids in the schools, then it's a waste of time. So they should be diagnostics. Like for now, like this year in particular, nobody should offer a test anywhere. It is ridiculous. We need to take care of our
Amen.
kids. Our kids need love, support. They need vacation time, right? So I'm against them this year. But I think we need to rethink what we do with tests. I have a problem with it. And more importantly, I just told you, you told me actually, any information that you don't use is deleted. So what is a multiple choice really measuring, right? It is not measuring learning. We know that it's extremely inefficient. And so they're trying to change that now by using performance-based assessments. It is more important now that you can make a clear decision about whether or not the science you're reading is accurate versus inaccurate with all of this bad information out. And so I think that's where we need to focus on what we call critical data literacy. That's where we need to head, in my opinion. Jessica says, how do you balance summative assessments outside of the classroom with meeting the demands of science tests that students need to pass to graduate? Yep, my question is geared more towards convincing the administration that the shift is the right shift. Totally understand. Now, I started this by saying they learn better. I've done research to say that they learn better. This will show up on your assessments because they learn better. And it's really dumb. Let me tell you how dumb it is. I'm telling you that if you don't speak in ways that are complicated, your kids will understand you better, right? And then if you introduce the words instead of just allowing them to fight through it and figure it out themselves, they'll learn it better. So if you teach in this way, they should learn better. The assessment should reflect that. We prove that. But here's the bigger issue.
It's super slow.
Right? You have to have a framework for improving schools and the connectedness of kids anyway, because just testing more doesn't work. And there's an entire industry of people who will tell you just cram before the test. And the problem is they don't know the information because you need to cram. I'm arguing if we know how people learn, which is I taught it to someone else, I had to explain it in a meaningful way. If you do that, it'll show up on a test as well. But I am against test for test's sake. Next question. As you work with teachers, what do you find helps them make a shift from language-focused or language-first instruction to application? That's a great question. I think the thing that I do with my teachers is just to ask them to ask the kids, what do you mean? So we just do a small in-class exercise is as the kids are asked to explain something, or if they're writing something, just to say, hey, what do you mean by that? Mm-hmm. And in those small interactions, what they end up finding out is that really kids use the words as the explanation. Let me try to explain that again. So if I were to say, why do you leave the pants on if I left pants out hanging to dry on a clothesline, why do they dry? Some kids would say evaporation, right? If you leave it at that, you might think they understand. But if you say, well, what do you mean by evaporation? Now they have to explain the phenomena. They have to describe what happens. And so in our practice, that is really what helps our teachers understand that there's a difference between the word and the meaning. And I need you to have both. But if you hide behind the word, teacher or student, then no one's going to get clarity. So really starting with making sure we do a lot of talking. And more importantly, what kid is going to talk to you? What kid's going to share their opinion with you if their whole life only the right answer is valued? You got to have a complete paradigmatic shift in your classroom so the kids are comfortable giving you the wrong answer, right? One of the things that's come from COVID is a lot of my teacher friends are telling me they get more responses because kids will offer it up in the chat or in a Google Doc. We get more interaction from having kids share. And if you're using things like Nearpod, you can even make them anonymous. And so now we're discovering ways to get greater interactions. So that's something we should carry forward as we move back into in-person classrooms. All right, here's another question from Laura. How do I know if a phenomena is truly relevant to students? Is there a way to evaluate if it's relevant enough to really stick in their memory? That is the question. So thank you for that question. I forgot to mention one crucial element. We argue that for every unit, we should do a pre-assessment. And the pre-assessment is to ask the kids, what do you know, where do you know it? So if I'm gonna teach protein synthesis, I need to figure out a way to figure out where do they know about protein? So I may ask them a question, well, tell me what protein is, where is it, why is it important? And I'm not looking for a right or wrong answer. Pre-assessment is not a pre-test. It's for me to get a sense of what they know. And so if they're saying, well, proteins are good for burning fat, muscle building, and everything is about the diet, then that's what I'm going to teach. The lesson on protein synthesis will be about bodybuilding, I guess, or fat burning or diets. But if it's about antibodies and COVID, then okay, we're going to talk about that. So you use your pre-assessment to give you the landmarks, right? So don't assume, and I think we all have done that. We teach great lessons for ourselves. But the question is, how do I really tap into what you know? And that requires some pre-assessment. Have you explored many citizen science? The screen just moved. Hold on 1 second. I lost that question. Here we go. Have you explored the many citizen science projects out there? April is Citizen Science Month. All right, let's do it. Now, this is what citizen science is about. My only critique of citizen science is it's about the teachers. It's not about the kids. It's what the teachers are interested in, not necessarily what the kids are. So this is a great point because there's existing curriculum and phenomena. You don't have to recreate the wheel. If you're a chemistry teacher, there's chemistry in the community, ChemCom. It's a super old curriculum that does this work for you. And so it is teaching chemistry in the context of community. And there's also Project Wild, which is a earth science community, but it's kind of hybrid biology and a little bit of chem there. But there are existing curriculum that you could use to engage in citizen science. But my thing is, it's not social justice teaching unless the kids are going to go do something. And when I say go do something, I mean produce something to express what they've learned. Does your research, this is the last question. Heather says, does your researching ELLs and what is the finding? Well, we found that our multi-language learners do better, have better gains overall when they're taught with simpler language, because the problem is not that that no one explicitly teaches them the science language, so it just becomes harder. And so in this way, in all of our studies, the ELL students have performed better than other groups, have the larger gains. All right, well, I thank you all for spending some time with me. Maybe this is the first of many conversations, and wishing you all well and doing that great teaching you're doing in Massachusetts. And I truly appreciate visiting today.
Brian, thank you so much. This was really, really a great